by looking at like what plagues were out there in our world history, and there are actually way more than this. But the ones with the gray arrows are the ones I'm going to be talking about, and I am going to be focusing on Western art history, although of course there have been plagues all over the globe. So we're going to start in a very ancient time with the plague of Athens that takes place in the year 430 BCE, which would be ancient Greece, actually classical ancient Greece period. And this was a plague that took place during a war between Sparta and Athens. And actually, Athens was at war with Sparta in what was called the Peloponnesian War. And this was the second year, because that war went on for like 27 years. The plague itself lasted about 5 years on and off. And the estimated deaths were about 100,000. And the symptoms of that plague were pretty congruent with what today would look like typhoid fever or Ebola virus. It started in the head and then worked its way down the body. Now, this particular war forced overcrowding in unsanitary living conditions within Athens, and is believed to this sort of unsanitary living conditions fueled the plague. And how it plays into art is that it claimed the life of a guy named Pericles, and his whole immediate family died, actually. Those of you that have taken art history with me before might recognize Pericles here. He was a leader in Athens. He was a statesman, an orator, and a general during what was known as Greece's Golden Age. He had actually led the Athenian army during the first 2 years of that war, and it has since been called the Age of Pericles. How he plays into art is that he promoted art and literature and actually fostered Athenian democracy, and had initiated a campaign to rebuild Athens' Acropolis, including the Parthenon, which had actually been sacked earlier. And this is a Roman copy of a marble of him that's from the year 430. So here we're looking at, on this slide, we're looking at a landscape of what the Acropolis in Athens looks like today, prominently with the building of the Parthenon, which was a temple to the goddess Athena. And he had overseen the whole building campaign on this Acropolis, including hiring the architects, Ictinus and Callicrates. Now, I can't really show you any art from that time outside of that, but when I mentioned in the beginning about imagination, here we see the imagination of what these plagues look like in ancient times in the work of a guy named Michael Sweerts, who was a painter in the Flemish Baroque in the middle of the 17th century. Now, this actually has two titles. It's either called Plague of Athens or Plague in an Ancient City. It's an oil on canvas that's in LACMA's collection in Los Angeles. And he painted this partly in response to the fact that he himself had endured a plague in Rome in the, sorry, I think that should say, yeah, no, that's right, mid-17th century. It's a pretty weird painting compositionally. I can't really go into it, but I think and people have studied this painting. People don't really know what's going on here or where it's at. It's pretty ambiguous, but I think it was his way of resolving his own issues around living in the time of plague, which again gets back to this idea of creativity and resilience and imagination. Now, I'm going to move on now to ancient Rome, to the Antonine or plague from between 160 and 180 CE. This was also called the Plague of Galen, after a physician who had documented this particular pandemic. It was actually brought to Rome by returning troops from the Near East. You remember that the Roman Empire was quite large, and people were always coming and going. This would have been during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, who famously wrote the Meditations, and his co-emperor and adopted brother, Lucius Verus. Now, this was probably in modern times, we would call it smallpox or measles. It's not really clear what caused this, but there were an estimated 5 million deaths throughout the Roman Empire. And there were about estimated 2,000 people dying daily just in the city of Rome. And this actually concluded the Pax Romana, which existed between the year 27 BCE and 180 CE, when a time when Rome was at the height of its power and stability as an empire. I was able to find images of the marble portraits of these co-emperors, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, who is on the right. Lucius Verus on the right, Marcus Aurelius is on the left. These are in the British Museum. And again, this idea of imagination. So here we actually have an engraving by a 19th century French artist called the Angel of Death striking a door during the plague of Rome. So these centuries old events still played out in modern artists later on. And I think you can see here, again, this idea of destruction and this angel of death knocking on the door. And then this figure of death here, skeleton-like face, assisting the angel. And actually, I just remembered, this was also a painting, and Levasseur did this based on a painting by another artist, but I'm sorry, the other artist's names left my mind. I thought the engraving was better anyway, so that's why I put it in the talk. Moving along, the Justinian plague in the year 541 CE, this would have been the time of the Byzantine Empire and early Christianity, and it took place during the reign of Emperor Justinian. And it was, just to give you an idea, at the height, the Byzantine Empire actually stretched from the Middle East to Western Europe. Now, this plague started in Egypt, spread to Palestine, and eventually Constantinople, Rome, and Britain. This was actually the first known occurrence of what will be known as the bubonic plague, and that's one of the deadliest in history. People wore their names on their clothing. This is how bad it was. You could be struck ill and incapacitated within minutes. That's how scary this plague was. So when people living in, say, Constantinople would leave their house, they would actually write or pin their name on their clothing in case they fell ill so their family could come and claim them. Now, some people did survive this illness, including Emperor Justinian. This did recur 4 times until the year 750. It weakened the Byzantine Empire. Actually, after that year of 542, Justinian couldn't even recruit and pay soldiers the way he had previously done to expand his empire. Now, this plague killed, but the estimates are pretty wide, somewhere between 25 to 100 million over 200 years. Here we have a detail of Emperor Justinian, which is on the famous apse mosaics in the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy. He was one of the greatest statesmen in history, and his co-regent was his wife, Empress Theodora. He was a very good emperor. He paid for the bodies of the abandoned and destitute to be buried. There were about 5,000 people dying every day in Constantinople of this plague. And it actually had a devastating economic effect on people like farmers and bakers. It wiped out the people who grew and made the food, made the bread, causing shortages and starvation. So you had other things on top of that. Now, Emperor Justinian plays into art history because he built the very famous Hagia Sophia church in the year 537, which is considered one of the architectural wonders of the world. Here's the exterior of that church. It's Constantinople was eventually called Istanbul, and that's what it looks like. It's one of the most famous pieces of dome architecture. It did serve as a Byzantine church, of course, in the time of Justinian. It was a church for his personal worship, and it also was a church for the Christian community in Constantinople. Now, again, an example of imagination about this particular uh, plague with a South Netherlandish artist known as the Master of Sebastian. Here we have his oil on panel painting called Saint Sebastian interceding for the plague stricken. Now, Saint Sebastian was the first Christian martyr in Rome. And there's actually another martyr too named Saint Roch who comes along. But Saint Sebastian is the one who got shot full of arrows and still lives. So he's a pretty common visual icon from the early Renaissance on. If you look up at my cursor here, I'm moving it in the upper left corner of the composition. We have the skewered Saint Sebastian pleading to God the Father in heaven, actually interceding for the plague stricken. People practiced social distancing back during this plague by not allowing visitors in their homes. So that might sound familiar today. But what probably doesn't sound so familiar is that priests back then would actually practice exorcisms because the belief system around why these plagues happened in early Christianity. Well, there were lots of scapegoats, which I'll be talking more about in a few minutes. But I'd never actually, before I did the research, I'd never seen this painting before. I think it's really interesting, and I just particularly love the little. I guess that's the devil up there. It's hard to tell. Now we'll move on to the Black Death, which actually, I know when I learned art history, I was told, oh, it started in Asia. But actually, that's being disputed now. It didn't necessarily start in Asia, but it did spread throughout Europe via shipping ports and was caused by the same thing as the plague of Justinian, a strain of bacteria that was spread by fleas on rodents. This was a really devastating plague. It wiped out a quarter to a half of the European population in just 2 years, which added up to be about 200 million people. The worst thing about it is that it kept coming back. So I've put on the screen some of the years in the 1300s it came back, but even after 1381, it still revisited populations over the next 300 years. And the symptoms would begin as flu-like, a swelling in the armpits, groins, and neck where your lymph nodes are. And as I was saying, because it's the same thing that caused the plague of Justinian, death could come as fast as 1 to 3 days. And as a result, people were buried in mass graves. It definitely changed the course of European history in the same way it devastated the Byzantine Empire. The economy was devastated by disrupting trade. And then, of course, the mass deaths of people like craftsmen, merchants, farmers, bakers, and even the customers. And then, of course, a famine followed. So here we have a fresco in the former abbey in France in the 14th century, depicting the plague personified as a woman. This would have been sometime in the 1300s. I don't have an exact date on this. I have to say it strikes me as a little ironic that women are depicted become the personification of something that kills you. But here, just to mention about the Catholic Church, which of course at this time, dominated most of Europe, it became very wealthy as a result of this plague, and because people started to turn towards religion. If they were sitting on the fence before, they were certainly going to sign up then because of the promise of salvation that the church offered, that is going to heaven as an afterlife. And it's also possible that this tragedy helped to form the Renaissance as society became more fluid and less rigid than it had been earlier. Just a couple, this slide and the next one are illustrations from manuscripts. You know, this is before the invention of the printing press. So people would handwrite books, usually in abbeys and monasteries, and hand illustrate them. Here we don't know who these, you know, illustrators were. Here we have the citizens of Belgium burying their dead during the Black Plague. And this was created somewhere between the year 1347 and 52. And it's a miniature. It's a pretty small, it's probably even smaller than what's on your screen right now. And then I have another one in regards to, oh, and one thing I wanted to point out, I just was very interested in this very complicated composition here, but particularly in these kind of individualized faces of the grieving and the people burying their dead, some of which are probably professional grave diggers, but also family members that have to put their dear ones in the ground. Here's another one. So what was really sad to me in doing my research was how one of the major scapegoats for the Black Death were Jewish folks. People were looking for any reason to blame other people, and that would include foreigners, beggars, lepers, and even people who had bad acne or some other skin disease were persecuted because they were believed to have caused or contributed to their, you know, people dying. So here is Jews being burned at the stake from 1349. Now, one of the important things about the Black Death, or one of the some phenomena that came out of the Black Death, was something called the Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre. It was an artistic genre of allegory from the late Middle Ages on the universality of death. It consists of personifications of death, inviting individuals from all walks of life to dance along to the grave, which is what we see here in Michael Wohlgemuth's. I'm not sure if this is an engraving or a woodcut. I'm not really sure what kind of print this was. I wasn't able to find out, but this is his print called The Dance of Death from 1493. Now, these, where you can see people literally dancing to the grave edge. So these served as what are called memento mori, which are basically is a key word in art history that means any kind of a symbol, such as a reminder of death, and that would include things like skulls, but it could also be candles and some other things that are kind of ephemeral or temporal. This one I always assign to my students. So here, we don't know who did this. This is another page out of a manuscript, but it's quite beautiful, I think you'll see. But at the same time, kind of off-putting with the little skulls between all the beautiful little, you know, arabesque motifs and embellishments that surround the illustration on the page, where we have death personified as a skeleton, tugging at the sleeve of a doctor, leading him to the great unknown. Now, it's a little hard to see because it's so tiny here. I couldn't get any details, but he's holding up a urine, a vial to the light to inspect it. And that's what doctors did in the late 15th century when they were trying to diagnose you. They would take a sample of your urine in a glass vial and then hold it up. And yeah, so I just thought this was sort of this weird juxtaposition of the doctor who could not save himself in terms of the Black Plague. Sometimes we'll see murals on buildings, such as this one from the 15th century, The Triumph of Death with the Dance of Death. Now, this is a fresco on a building in a place called Clusone, Italy, that takes place, or was put up in the 15th century. You could see it's not in such fantastic shape, but enough of it is still there to see what's going on. I have some more slides for you of it. The earliest known examples of the dance of death don't actually occur in visual art. They're found in story poems about encounters between dead and the living. And these story poems were typically featured power figures such as knights and bishops. And in fact, here with this, I have a bit of a detail for you. You can see this is exactly what's going on here. So death is represented prominently in the middle of the composition as a skeleton queen, and she's holding these fantastic scrolls that fly out of her hands. I don't know what they say, so I can't help you there. And I wasn't actually able to find that information. But she's standing on top of a marble coffin, which holds corpses of the emperor and the pope. And then around her, there's characters from different social classes walking with the skeleton to join that dance, the dance of death. And in fact, some people, the richer people, are offering valuables and beg for mercy in the foreground of the marble coffin. And I don't know if, I don't know, I guess but let me point out here that accompanied by the death queen, she has two other skeletons killing people rather indiscriminately. We have a bow and arrow over here. And then I'd never heard of this this weapon, but it begins with an A. I can't pronounce it. Sorry about that. Probably one of the most famous paintings that comes out of the Black Plague is The Triumph of Death, which by Peter Bruegel the Elder, who was a painter in the Dutch Renaissance from 1562. This is an oil on panel, and it's very large. It's 46 inches high and over 5 feet long. That's in the Prado in Madrid. What Bruegel serves up to us is an apocalyptic view of the end of time, the end of the earth. There's a lot going on in this painting, and it would probably take me 20 minutes to go through it all. So I'm just going to point out a couple things. One is here. This is death on a pale horse leading executioners to kill humanity. There's fires that burn in the distance rather ominously, and the sea itself is full of shipwrecks. And like we saw with the fresco, this painting shows people from different stations in life. There's a king, a cardinal, chess players, a romantic couple, a knight, all being slaughtered because, the Black Death didn't discriminate on who you were. Now, that Black Plague kept coming back in Europe. So I'm just going to mention a couple artists that addressed the idea of plague in the imagination. And one of them is Tintoretto, from a master from the Venetian Renaissance. He painted this very large painting. It's an oil on canvas that's 10 feet high and 22 feet long, so that's huge, called St. Roch in the Hospital. You can see the saint is figured prominently in the middle of the composition, examining the symptoms of a semi-nude male there. This comes from 1549. Tintoretto was commissioned to decorate a building in Venice that was owned by a confraternity named after the saint who was known as the protector of plagues. So you remember there were two saints that I've mentioned so far, Saint Sebastian and St. Roch as protector of plagues. So people would beseech these saints' names on their behalf. And this particular canvas, as I said, tells the story of the saint's visit to heal the plague-stricken. He did a number of paintings in that particular building in Venice. And speaking of Venice, we have an architect by the name of Palladio from the Italian Renaissance, who designed this particular church called the Church of the Holy Redeemer. And it was consecrated back in 1592, so at the bottom of the 16th century. Now, the reoccurrence of the Black Plague in the 16th century actually killed about a third of Venice's population. And the Doge, or the ruler of the city, promised God that he would build a church when the plague passed. And so Palladio was eventually commissioned to design this church that would replace an existing one, but he would add a bridge. Now, the facade of this church is inspired by the Pantheon in Rome, which was the the Roman temple to all the sky gods, done by Hadrian. But what Palladio would do was add 15 steps at here at this entrance. That was a reference to the Temple of Jerusalem, intended to bring the adherent closer to devotion as they entered the church. And even today, there are in Venice, the Venetians have every July, I forget the date, I want to say July 15th, but I'm not sure. They have a procession over the bridge to celebrate the Catholic Feast of the Redeemer. And I do have an interior shot of that church. As you can see here, this was a post-plague pilgrimage church, meaning that people visited this church to pray on pilgrimages that they were taken. And it was intended to thank God for deliverance from death. It has a single nave with 3 chapels on both sides, which I really can't show you because I don't have time to go into a lot of details, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how beautiful the church was on the inside. Titian, another major painter that comes out of Venice, the Venetian Renaissance, died of the Black Death fever in Venice in 1576. And actually, right after his death, his son and his painting assistant also died. And this was actually the painting that Titian was working on at the time of his death. And the Black Death was gripping Venice. This is 1576. And it's kind of an unusual painting, actually. It's a nocturnal scene of suffering that he intended to decorate his tomb. How old he was when he died is disputed. It's believed he was somewhere in his 80s to the age of 100. But it is a Pietà scene, which is actually kind of unusual for Venetian artists. You see Pietas more in Rome. When he died, it was incomplete, and it was completed by another artist named Giovanni. And it's as you can see, it's a pretty large painting at 153 inches high. So another self-portrait, this is Anthony Van Dyck from 1621, an oil on canvas. This is just a detail of it. It's in the Met up in New York. Interesting story. Van Dyck did not die of the Black Plague, but he happened to be in Palermo, Sicily, when that plague broke out and killed most of the population there. And citizens were quarantined for 5 months, during which times the remains of this particular saint were discovered in a cave. She was the city's patron saint. Her name is Rosalie. She actually had died in 1106, but during the plague, they had found her remains in Palermo, as I said, in some cave. And apparently, or allegedly, her name was even scrawled into the wall of the cave. You know, I don't know, but, and interestingly enough, so Van Dyck decided he would paint this amazing scene of Saint Rosalie interceding for the plague-stricken of Palermo, on top of a self-portrait that he had started in grisaille. Grisaille is the kind of underpainting in a monochrome color. He did not finish it. He got out of Palermo as soon as he could, and he ended up completing it in Genoa, Italy. This is in the Met too, also, if you ever get a chance to go back to the Met and see it. Moving forward in modern times now, we have the epidemic hitting Philadelphia, the Philadelphia yellow fever. And at the time, you know, it was the capital of the US. Yellow fever was a very acute, infectious, hemorrhagic viral disease that was acquired by mosquito bites. Interestingly enough, the cause of the fever was not discovered until 1881, and a cure was not discovered until 1937. And it was also one of those illnesses that resulted in a pretty quick death. Now, what happened with the yellow fever in Philadelphia was that mosquitoes came up from the tropics on ships to Delaware river ports. The famous Benjamin Rush was the first doctor to identify the illness, and he actually became a huge leader in organizing the response, being kind of the hero of the day. You know, hospitals like now with the coronavirus were really unprepared for this fever in Philadelphia, and there were severe nursing shortages. There were 5,000 deaths in Philadelphia. I should point out that 20,000 people left the city, including Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. And this is very common for a lot of the plagues I've been telling you about, actually. Even in the plague of Rome, the Antonine Plague, the rich people headed for the hills in their summer houses and left everybody else in the city. So in terms of art, I was trying to find like, well, what kind of art was made during this time? Well, actually, it plays into this narrative of the yellow fever in Philly. African Americans played a really important role as volunteers. Benjamin Rush had believed that blacks were immune to it, but 240 people did die of it. But they played roles as volunteers, nurses, cart drivers, coffin makers, and grave diggers. Now, I'm giving you here two portraits. The one on the left is Richard Allen when he's 25 years old, and the one on the right is Absalom Jones by the Philadelphia painter Raphael Peale. Now, both of these men were born slaves, but they were part of Philadelphia's free Black community, and they were both happened to be religious leaders. Richard Allen was an itinerant preacher. I just want to quote, now I don't know who said this. I don't know if Jones said this or Allen said this, but I thought it was a great quote. Many white people have acted in a manner that would make humanity shudder. This one is an unknown artist of chalk and pastel that was done during some kind of religious convention. And then this one's in the Delaware Museum of Art by Raphael Peale, if you want to go see it when the museum reopens. The American polio epidemic began in New York City, 1916, mostly in Brooklyn. There were 27,000 cases and 6,000 deaths. Now, this was a person-to-person spread of an ancient virus via tainted water and food, basically food or water that had been tainted with some kind of fecal material. What it would do, it was weaken muscles and cause paralysis. Children were the main victims in this particular epidemic, and some left with permanent disabilities, such as Franklin Roosevelt. A vaccine was developed in 1954 by Jonas Salk, and the last reported case of polio, as far as I know, was in 1979. Now I'm going to mention two artists that both had polio as children. One is Dorothea Lange, the famous photographer. She was born in Hoboken in 1895. She was an American documentary photographer of social realism. She had contracted the polio at age 17 and suffered a weakened right leg and a twisted foot, and she was not able to put her heel down. But despite these disabilities, she traveled the world. She sold photographs to earn money and support her trip. And even when she ran out of money, she would settle in San Francisco and worked in a photography studio. So I also have a quote by her I thought that was pretty interesting. It was perhaps the most important thing that happened to me. It formed me, guided me, instructed me, helped me, and humiliated me. All those things at once. I've never gotten over it, and I am aware of the force and power of it. I'll just show you quickly one of probably her most famous photograph of Migrant Mother from 1936. This was an iconic representation that she did while working for the Farm Security Administration's agenda, which was a Depression era agency. And in the photograph, we see pea pickers, a mother and her three of her. Oh, is that for me? Am I muted, Vita?
No, I unmuted you. I just muted everybody and then unmuted you.
Oh, I got you. Okay, thanks. I couldn't see. There was a weird pop-up on my screen. Another artist I'll mention is Frida Kahlo that suffered from polio. We all know Frida Kahlo had that terrible bus accident when she was 16. But actually before that, at the age of 6, she had polio afflicting her right leg as well, that left her bedridden for months. And then combined with that terrible accident, she would actually end up suffering 30 surgeries, many hospitalizations, and countless months of bed rest. Yet she, like Dorothea Lange, who photographed on, Kahlo painted on. And I wanted to show you, I'm just going to show you this one by her. So in addition to her leg deformity, she had decreased circulation to her right foot, which caused a lot of bleeding that you can see in this very famous painting called What the Water Gave Me from 1938. If you look closely over here, you can see that she's bleeding between her toes, her great toe and her second toe. This was a year painted before her death. I'm sorry, a year before her death, her right leg was amputated. And then a quote from her: "Feet, why do I want them when I have wings to fly?" Which I found, when I read that, I found that really, really touching. I'm not going to go into the rest of the painting. You know, she comes out of the tradition of surrealism, but almost everything in here is autobiographical. The Spanish flu epidemic was one of the deadliest in history. Estimated 500 million people were afflicted globally, and 17 to 50 million people died. Now, this flu, they believe, actually, modern day scholars believe that this originated in Kansas, believe it or not. World War I hastened the spread of it, and that was by sneezing and coughing. Now, the Spanish flu came in 4 waves. It killed mostly young adults from, and this might sound familiar to those of you that are paying attention to the coronavirus syndrome, causes something called a cytokine storm. And the second wave, actually, there were 4 waves, but the second wave was actually deadlier than the first wave. Egon Schiele was actually an artist who died of the Spanish flu. He was an Austrian expressionist, born in 1890 and a major 20th century figure painter. Here is a portrait he did, a self-portrait and a portrait of his wife, Edith, who was 6 months pregnant when she died of the Spanish flu. He died 3 days after his wife, but yet he sketched her while she was on her deathbed. And actually his teacher and mentor, another painter by the name of Gustav Klimt, also died of the Spanish flu. So I found this painting's a little confusing. It looks like the child has been born here, but this was in his imagination, because at the time she was pregnant when this was painted, early stages of her pregnancy. And I found these as well. This is the portrait of dying Edith Schiele. And remember, he will catch the flu and die within days. And this is his teacher, another portrait he did as well, Gustav Klimt, on his deathbed, both from 1918. Another Spanish flu victim, but a survivor, is Edvard Munch, very famous, of course, for the Scream. Here's a self-portrait he did after he recovered from the Spanish flu in 1919, and this particular painting's in Oslo, which is where the Scream is as well, by the way. And I'm going to end this talk with the AIDS pandemic and epidemic that started in 1981 and to the present day. And I imagine most of you guys that are listening to me have heard of this. It's a virus known as HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. It's a zoonotic virus that was originally transmitted jumped from a chimpanzee to a human in West Africa in the 1920s. AIDS is not, even today, not exactly curable, but treatable since the 1990s. Although in my research, I did find that there are 2 people who are on the record as being cured. I don't know if two people means there is a cure, but it, you know, there have been two people. But over, in general, it has claimed about 35 million lives across the globe. I'm going to mention, it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of art that we see around HIV. This person, Therese Frere, who took this very famous photograph that was published in Time magazine in November of 1990. Maybe some of you remember it, called Final Moments. She was actually as a journalism student at the University of Ohio in Columbus, and she had made friends with this guy who worked at this AIDS hospice in Columbus, Ohio. I don't remember. Yes, this is David Kirby. I was gonna say I don't remember his name, but I wrote it down so I would remember it. David Kirby, that's him here, the dying patient. He and being, you know, very touchingly embraced by his father. His mother is to the right, and I believe that is his sister, also being held by his mother. So she was photographing people in the hospice. She got permission from David Kirby earlier on when he first was admitted to hospice. And then there was a nurse that took care of David, but I can't remember the name of this person, who was sort of like a non-binary person who would also go on to die of AIDS, and Frere also captured his death as well. But I'm only going to show you the very famous one. And there's a number of these that are published. And if you're interested, it's pretty easy to look up online. An artist I want to mention, probably my favorite artist from this time period, is Felix Gonzalez Torres, who died in 1996 of HIV. He was a Cuban, openly gay, American visual artist known for sculptures and installations. And of course, I can't turn down a portrait that doesn't have a kitty cat in it. So this is untitled, this particular image. But actually all of his artworks are untitled, and then another title is kind of put in parentheses. Let me see if I can move this thing here. Yeah, this is a portrait of Ross in LA, right? This is from 1991. The person is not part of the installation actually, but it is an interactive artwork. So the artwork consists of individually wrapped candies, of which there is an endless supply. And the ideal weight of the candies is supposed to be 175 pounds. So this particular one was in the Art Institute. And then what you'll see is a visitor taking the candy, because what Gonzalez Torres wanted visitors to do was to take the candy and consume it. Altogether, he did 19 candy installations. This is only one of the 19. And all of them around this idea of ideal weight, 175 pounds, has to do with the weight of his partner, Ross Laycock, who had died this very same year that he created this one, of HIV as well. Taking the candy has a couple different things going on here. One is the viewer symbolizes the depletion of the body by the virus. So as you could saw with the image of David Kirby, you know, if you've got HIV, you will look pretty skeletal typically when you die of HIV. So there's this idea of maintaining that weight. It's important for HIV people to maintain their weight. So by taking the candy, Gonzalez Torres is thinking, well, this is the depletion of the body by the virus. So there's a kind of loss. But it also represents the sweetness of love by way of the eternal replacement of the candy. And it's actually one of the most beautiful works of art. I wrote my dissertation about art in modern and contemporary art. This particular work did not make it into my dissertation, but I've always been struck with how we can symbolize love in art. And I think this is, for me, one of the top ones on my list. And then finally, this is my final slide, for those of you that got to get going. This is the names. This may look familiar to many of you. The Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt, which consists of thousands of panels commemorating those living with HIV or those that have died of it. As of 2006, there were 83,900 names. I wasn't able to get an update for 14 years later. It was conceived of by an activist, I believe he was in San Francisco, by the name of Cleve Jones in 1985. And it's the largest community folk art in the world, made by individuals or even in workshops. It weighs 54 tons at the time of 2006, and it's comprised of 3-foot by 6-foot panels, comprised mostly of fabric, but there's all other kinds of materials that are sewn onto the panels. I was not able to get a close-up of that, but here it is being displayed in Washington, D.C. at one point. I'm not sure when this happened. I think this was in the 90s. So that I'm going to take questions if you have any. I'm not an expert on pandemic art, but I have learned a thing or two in the past couple weeks putting this together. I want to thank you for listening if you're not sticking around for questions. And I'd also would ask you to email me at arthistorymystery@gmail.com, which you can email me questions or comments or any kind of feedback you want to offer me, corrections if you believe I got something wrong, and to be put on my mailing list. I want to thank you very much for coming. Back to you, Vida.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. That was fascinating. I guess one question that I had was, after doing all this research, how has this affected your own perception of our contemporary pandemic of COVID-19?
Well, I'll tell you, it actually has a lot. That's one of the reasons I took the project on after you suggested it. Being in socially distanced now since my classes all shut down in the very beginning of March, freaking out if I even have to make a grocery store run, or if I'm riding my bike and somebody runs past me without a mask or something. I happen to be high risk for this particular virus. It makes me think how lucky I am, actually, that we live in an age of technology where I can actually safely quarantine myself, and work and continue to do my work. Whereas if you look at these plagues, a lot of times that was just not the case, at least not until the 20th century, when you have people like Kahlo and Dorothea Lange, and even, Gonzalez Torres, who are artists that worked within their illness anyway. I'm not even sick, but yet I get to work, and and there's always the worry, the specter of death or whatever. I don't know. It put things in perspective a little bit for me, to answer your question. I don't know if I'm hoping that'll happen to the people who were in attendance for this lecture. Maybe you could let me know if you think it did.
Yeah. For me, it really did. It in some way made me feel a little less like this is an experience that's unique or individual or isolating. Like, I felt a sense of camaraderie with a history of humanity that has had to deal with horrific moments like this throughout history. And it has put me a little bit more, in a weird way, at ease, or in companionship with those who came before me. So thank you for that. One other question that I had was, there's a way in which, especially in more ancient and medieval times, that death is described and thought of, that's really different, I feel like, in the way that we treat the subject of mortality today. Do you feel that way? Can you speak to that?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to answer that. Can you maybe ask that question again,
Sure.
or another way? Yeah.
Sure, just in the art itself, in the paintings and the drawings, but in culturally too, it feels like the topic of death was treated really differently than it is today. Do you feel that way, or is?
Oh, um, I'm not sure how to answer that, but I understand your question. Um, and and I think what it seems like right now, because people can't even have funerals, you know, because of social distancing, and the infectious nature of today's virus, people, we don't, only the medical workers and janitors in hospitals and funerary, people that work at funerary homes, or people that are carting to the death to public graves like they did in New York. I mean, they're the only ones that are seeing death right now. And I think I didn't put anything about, I mean, there is art being made right now, but I didn't put it in this lecture because I think it's still playing out. I think there's a lot of imagery to come. I think there's a lot of narratives to come from these people, from nurses and doctors and respiratory therapists and grave diggers. So in a way, in a weird way, today's virus, we are not seeing dead laying in the street, like they did in the Black Plague, in the Justinian plague. And even in the Philadelphia yellow fever, we're not seeing that. And, I think that does change the kind of way that death is framed. That's the only way I can answer your question right now, is
Yeah.
that's what strikes me. And I was thinking, I know I've been thinking about it since I finished this lecture a couple days ago.
It just
But
seems
thanks for
a
the question.
lot more visible in ancient and medieval times. Like it's
Mhm.
represented a lot more strikingly, whereas
Right.
Felix Gonzalez Torres is taking a metaphor and creating
Mhm.
this beautifully visual, conceptual piece about death. In ancient and medieval times, it is visualized as the angel of death and the skeleton, and there's so much more, in a way, blunt reality to it, or something.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Cool. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Kathryn. I don't think we have any other questions
Oh, really?
so
Because
far.
well, we got like a couple minutes left, right? A couple.
We
Uh,
do.
can I just personally ask people? I hope I haven't shocked you too much with this lecture, but can I just have any kind of feedback from anybody, whether you had to leave because it was too much, or well, if you left, you can't ask that question, I suppose. But if you learned
Well,
something
no,
from it.
pretty much nobody left. Everybody who came in
Oh,
stayed.
okay. Okay. Well,
So that's good news.
okay, cool. So if anybody is brave, because I can't see you.
I'll say something. Can you see me, Kathryn?
No, but who is it? Can you tell me who you are?
Christine Lafuente.
Oh my God. Hi, Christine. Thanks for joining in. A former Fleischer faculty. All right.
I know. Hang on a second. You can't see me. Oh, okay.
I
Well,
can't because I'm sharing my screen, Christine.
well, I just want to say thank you. I mean, I learned so much, and I agree that it really put things in perspective, the whole kind of history of humanity. And I did not find it reassuring because, there's such a, that because, things are coming out of the White House saying, it'll be gone by Easter and it's going to go away. And, but the reality is it's a lot.